Hello, my name is Nathan Brummel. Today we take a second look at the life of the reformer and preacher Theodore Beza. In part one, we began to look at this great courtly reformer as a child, and we traced his early education, and we met his teacher, his very influential teacher, Melchior Womar. And then we concluded by looking at his legal studies. And now, as a graduate with his licentiate in law, he returns back to Paris. And it is his father's hope that he will become a lawyer, support the family, and make some money. But his father's attitude is going to become that his young son, his graduate, is a perpetual student who's a ne'er-do-well. So now we look at Beza in Paris from 1539 to 1548. Beza returns to the French capital at the age of 21. He has his life in front of him. He comes from the upper classes. He has a marvelous education. But he doesn't have work in mind like his dad hopes. He has further literary studies in mind. Of course, it's humorous that Beza is often portrayed as some type of stern, scholastic, logical person who doesn't care about the heart and humanistic studies. Well, the reality is that the young man comes back and he doesn't want to do law. He doesn't want to engage in just this abstract sort of job where you try to argue what's right and what's wrong in the legal courts. He's not just interested in abstract concepts and ideas. He doesn't want to be a lawyer. All he has in mind is further literary studies. He had many friends, abundant leisure time, and plenty of money. He's well off financially. He was the recipient of the revenues of two rich benefices that together amounted to about 700 gold crowns a year. So he has the opportunity to have leisure and to pursue his studies. Friends in high places had provided these benefices, even though Beza never planned on becoming a cleric. These, you see, were benefices that were supposed to go to someone who would be a priest. But in those days, the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church, which hadn't ceased even though the Reformation had taken off, involved people giving promising students one of these benefices. And what he would do is simply hire some lowly paid person to function like the pastor priest in a certain village, and he could pocket a bunch of the money, which he could use to fund his education. So Beza is not interested in working. He's not interested in becoming a lawyer. He wants to be a humanist scholar and a poet. He wants to imitate the life of Erasmus, a life of study and research. Now, he could have had a bright future in the state. That's where law could have taken him into high places. He also could have had a bright future in the Roman Catholic Church, but he doesn't seek ordination. Now, his uncle Nicholas, had died some years before. But another uncle, the Abbé de Freudmort, was just as attached as the judge had been to the nephew. This uncle had fully made up his mind, we're told, that Theodore should succeed him in his abbey. Now notice what's going on. His uncle is the abbot. He's the head of a monastery. And guess how much money he made each year as the head of the monastery? 5,000 gold crowns. So the young graduate has the opportunity to join a monastery, take a vow of poverty, be a monk, but not be a lowly monk, be the abbot who heads the monastery and who has the princely income of 5,000 gold crowns a year. And yet the young man doesn't want that either. So this young graduate had wealth, ease, comfort, and the opportunity to read and write. And this puts his father into consternation. His father simply couldn't relate to this. He's kind of like the student who is viewed as, the young man that's viewed as a perennial student, never wants to stop studying, wants to work on his master's degree, and then his doctoral degree, and then his postdoctoral degree. His dad's view is time to get a job. But Beza was into his literary studies, and later on, yes, he recognized that all the advantages that had been set before him were, he says, but snares laid for his feet by the powers of evil, with a view of preventing him from choosing the path which his inner convictions prompted him to enter upon. Do you see what he's saying there? He's saying he had learned from Melchior Womar how he ought to live, what he ought to believe, but his position in his life, his wealth, his ease, making an idol out of literary studies, wanting to imitate the prince of humanists, Erasmus, made it so that he wasn't willing to sacrifice all that he had to join the despised Lutherans. Now, he did have a desire, you see, to leave France and join his old teacher in Germany. With Melchior Womar, he could freely profess his conscientious convictions because he had some. Even though this would have meant the loss, you see, of his more brilliant worldly prospects and the life of ease and high culture and friendship that he enjoyed in Paris. Now, Beza's dad fully expected his son to devote himself to the legal profession. His father had a business, but he assumed that this is what Beza would do in order to make sure that, he participated in the whole family moving ahead. But the thought of becoming a lawyer filled Beza with absolute disgust. We're told, as much as the father insisted, so much the son resisted, urging, not without reason, that his previous training, not to speak of his natural bent of his mind, disqualified him from the lucrative but repulsive profession to which he was urged. So his dad said, "You can make a lot of money with your diploma in law." His response is, "I am just disgusted at the thought of this." And so he'd get in arguments with his dad daily, extended arguments, lively arguments, as you can imagine, among two very passionate Frenchmen. Dad thought that his boy wanted to remain the irresponsible eternal student. Time to get a job. So this caused a lot of tension. A hitting of heads between Beza and his dad. Well, Beza's oldest brother tried to step in and play the peacemaker. And his older brother interceded for Theodore. Well, with Theodore and the oldest brother, dealing with dad, father became less troubled and hard-headed, and domestic harmony was restored. But here was the deal. The two brothers would rent a different house at common expense, that is, they'll each pay half. And then the older brother, and this was very sacrificial on his part, he said, "I'll devote myself to the family affairs, to take care of the affairs that are too much for dad, and then my younger brother will have the chance to enjoy his liberty to study." Well, what an older brother. Basically, older brother is saying, I'll bring home the bacon, I'll do the hard work for the family, and my little brother can just pursue his studies. Well, this worked out for a little while. Beza tells us, "I lived 1 year and then a second in by far the most blessed manner, since I lacked neither leisure, nor any kind of teachers, nor abundance of means, nor, in fine, the inclination to master those studies, which, as you know, have pleased me supremely." Now, don't think that Beza is being a lazy bum. What he's doing is he's learning Hebrew. What he's doing is he's learning how to read Greek better. So it's true that he wasn't working in the family business, but you mustn't think that he was idle. No, he was very busy. He was passionate, and he had a good intellect, and he was hard at work in his studies. And so this went for about 2 years. 2 years of leisure. This is the dream of the humanist. This is like the ancient Greek philosophers, the life of a philosopher. This is what Augustine, the church father, wanted after his conversion. Just leisurely time to grow in literary studies and in Bible and in the knowledge of the Bible and so on. And then Beza's brother suddenly died. Well, this was a blow to the family and, of course, to Theodore's plans. And Theodore's dad, Pierre, wrote him saying, "I am weighed down by a great mass of affairs and have reached an advanced age. It is but just and fair that you, my son, upon whom all my hopes are fixed, should assume the burden. Yield at length and consult your own best interests and the interests of your friends, and give up those empty and profitless studies which you have pursued for so many years." Now, the dad is basically right in the sense that his son has been pursuing these studies for all the wrong reasons, really for matters of pride. Yes, it's true that there's a desire to understand the Bible, to read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, and yet he's not really being motivated by the glory of God. He simply is doing this out of his own selfish interests. He's doing this because he views the life of the humanist as the ideal lifestyle. And I don't know how he could argue against a dad who could write like that. I mean, his dad comes on strong. This is the appeal of a father to a son saying, "Hey, I'm old and tired. It's time for you to step up and help out in the family business." I don't know how Beza could resist, but yet we are told that Theodore resisted even now with great determination. I'm still amazed by how Beza resisted his father even after the death of his elder brother, and even after his father had so graciously put up with this whole situation where the older brother would basically do the family work and he could just have the time to study. But he resisted with great determination, we're told. So once again, an uncle steps in. His uncle, the Abbe de Freudmont, the abbot of the monastery that Beza wouldn't even decide and agree to join so that he could become the heir of his uncle. Well, his uncle stepped in and he decided he would umpire the family situation. And he wrote the dad this. He said, "Inasmuch as Theodore is so averse to the practice of the law, let him indeed continue in the course upon which he has entered. Let him, however, become the client of some prince or magnate from whom there may be hope of deriving some fruit of his labors." So what the uncle says is, he says, let your son continue his humanist studies, but let's make sure that there's some fruit from his labors. So what we should do is set him up with a wealthy man, a prince, who can basically support and fund a humanist scholar, since that's how many humanists could be provided for and make money, because a rich person would take them in. They would feel that their court was honored by having such an intellectual in their midst. But Beza had no interest in going to a court where he would have to ingratiate himself with a powerful person to get financial support. In fact, he was happy to get by on the money he had. But they looked for a wealthy patron, and they chose the Bishop of Coutances as his patron. And so Theodore is introduced to the palace and household of this magnate. But suddenly there was a storm of wars, and some political and military events made this bishop so busy that he didn't have time and attention to devote to someone like a Beza. And so Beza didn't have to do his job there after all. And so the young man gleefully wrote, "Thus has it come to pass that I have returned to my former manner of life, in which, unless some greater force shall hinder, I shall assuredly grow old. And I feel confident that at length I shall leave to posterity the proof that Beza did not live utterly idle, albeit he lived in the greatest leisure." So notice what he's saying. He's saying, I don't have to go and try to basically, satisfy someone else and kind of work for them in whatever way. And he says, I'm not going to go there again. I'm not going to let Dad talk me into that again. But he says, on the other hand, posterity is going to know that I haven't been just lazy. It's not like he's just whiling away the days of his life. He's been very busy in his scholars. So he was busy. He devoted hours to the reading of Hebrew. He read widely in Latin and in Greek. I think of young kids today, they go to college, they come back home with their graduate degree, and then they can't find a job that's in line with what they graduated for. And, they don't want to work at McDonald's or get a different blue-collar job, so they just stay home and play Nintendo, or not Nintendo nowadays, but other, fancier online gaming games. It's not like Beza was doing that. He perfected his mathematics. He reads widely in Latin and in Greek. Now, in the midst of this, the son back in Paris undergoes a protracted spiritual struggle. Now, there's a battle going on for his heart and his soul at this time, and it is protracted. That struggle was evident in, of all things, his secret marriage. Now, thankfully, Beza did not live a life of fornication, but he did enter into a secret marriage. He never took the first steps towards becoming ordained as a priest. Now, remember, he had these benefices that you would normally get in the way of becoming a priest. Well, therefore, he has good reason to keep shush and quiet about the fact that he has a wife. I mean, the Roman Catholics would put up with people receiving benefices who weren't actually ordained functioning priests, but it was a whole different matter if you actually publicly took a wife. Well, then suddenly it would not work out for you to receive those benefices. Now, he had not taken the priestly vows that required celibacy. He even hoped at this point, with a secret wife, to receive more benefices in the future. Roman Catholics would not be shocked at a layman fattening himself on the church's pastures. They would not be overly troubled by a layman who even fell into the sin of fornication. It was so common. Roman Catholics would just become unhappy when a layman who received benefices was known to be publicly married. Now, Beza apparently fell in love with a young woman named Claudine Desnas. She was of a reputable family, although inferior in station to his own. In 1544, Beza entered into a secret marriage with this lady. He had witnesses at the wedding, two of his friends, both jurists, Laurent de Normandy and Jean Crespin. Now, while the secrecy with which this marriage was entered into must be condemned, yet we're going to see that 4 years into the future, he is going to publicly celebrate this marriage. But it is, from the very beginning, a very harmonious marriage, a very congenial marriage that would last until the death of Claudine, many, many years into the future. But this is evidence of the immaturity in his heart and in his soul. Why does he hide the marriage? Well, he doesn't want to give up the good money he's making from his benefices. And then there's this, he wants the reputation, see, of being a philosopher, a humanist. Erasmus never married. He wanted to have the reputation of a new philosopher who is not caught up with the things of this world. And so he enters into a committed marriage with his wife. Now, another important thing in his younger years is that in 1548, Beza published his Juvenilia. Now, you can see that word comes from the word juvenile. This is the publication of a young humanist. They're the writings, really, of a very promising writer, the brilliant writer of a man of letters. And he had written these pieces of poetry and then circulated them among his friends and admirers. Juvenilia was a work of poetry, and Beza dedicated them to his first teacher, Melchior Walmar, although later on he would be embarrassed about the fact that he did this. He's 28 or 29 years old at this time. Still hasn't found a real job. He has given himself to his humanist studies. Later, as a reformer, Beza at age 40, that's some 12 years later, would dedicate a second volume to his beloved teacher, Melchior Wolmar. And that would be his book, A Confession of the Christian Faith. And at that time, he gave two reasons for doing so. The one was that he might honor Wolmar for all the seeds he had sown in the education of Beza. The second reason is that he wanted to offer a better book than the poems that he had written earlier on. In fact, Wolmar had even encouraged him to publish them or to republish them. And he felt that really that book had been a little beneath Wolmar, and so he wanted to dedicate a better book to him. Now, at the same time, these poems in the Juvenilia are not as bad as some people have claimed, and Beza therefore even actually published them later to prove the point. But he would be embarrassed at certain points in his career because people were aware of those books. He had written about a mistress in one of these poems and called her Candida. And this was written before Beza turned 20 years old. Now, Beza said this later. He says, "There are among my poems a few that are written in somewhat too free a tone, that is, in imitation of Catullus and Ovid. But I had not the slightest fear at that time, nor do I now fear, lest those who knew me as I was should gauge my morals by those playful inventions of my imagination." In other words, the things that he wrote about didn't reflect the fact that he was involved in illicit relationships with women. He also said, "As respect to those poems, who is there that either has condemned them more than I, their unhappy author, or that detests them more than I do today? Would therefore that they might at length be buried in perpetual oblivion. And may the Lord grant that, since it is impossible that what has been done should be undone, the persons who shall read writings of mine far different from those poems may rather congratulate me upon the greatness of God's goodness to me than accuse him who voluntarily makes confession and deprecates the fault of his youth." So Beza, as you can see, is embarrassed by these early works of poetry, and yet he says, "Hey, look at the contrast. Look at what I now write as a Christian to the glory of God." Now, in the next section, we're going to look at the vital year of 1548, because that is the year in which God does a mighty work of grace in this rather cocky, self-centered, proud, upper-class French young man. And there is evidence immediately that a new change, a big change has happened in this young man's heart. So next time in part 3, we will look at the year 1548 and what happened there.